Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners of this land on which we deliver our services. We pay our respects to elders and leaders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar topic is the WHS Act 2020 for volunteers and volunteer organisations. There will be a short presentation followed by a question and answer session. Our presenters today are David Eyre and Bill Mitchell. David is the Acting Project Manager for the WHS Legislation Project and has over 21 years of strategic policy, project management and team leadership, including 16 years in the public sector. His experience includes a broad range of public sector strategic policy and reform initiatives, covering safety and health in the resources and general industry sectors, environmental and offshore petroleum regulation and customer service reforms. He currently works as part of the Work Health and Safety Legislation Project team. Bill has a postgrad certificate in business law and more than 20 years experience in policy development. He is the General Manager for the Work Health and Safety Project and has been involved with this project since its commencement in 2008. We hope you enjoy today's webinar. Thank you.
Good afternoon, this is David Eyre speaking. There's over 600,000 volunteers in Western Australia, ranging from sporting and recreation to assisting people in their homes and emergency response. So there's a wide range of sectors to cover in this. We'll try and do our best to cover that for you. But the first thing I'd like to mention before we start is that it's important to note that the Work Health and Safety laws are not significantly different to the current Occupational Safety and Health Act requirements. Generally, if volunteer organisations have a duty under the OSH Act, then they'll also have a duty under the Work Health and Safety Act. The main differences are that the Work Health and Safety Act provides more clarity over health and safety duties and accountabilities. So a key question to determine whether the Work Health and Safety Act applies in your organisation is, does your volunteer organisation employ and pay anyone to carry out work? If the answer is yes, then the Work Health and Safety Act does apply, and the organisation and the workers and the volunteers that it engages have work health and safety duties. If the answer is no, then your organisation is considered to be a volunteer association. This means that the Work Health and Safety Act doesn't apply, it does not apply. However, Australian courts do recognise that volunteers are owed a general duty of care by the people and the organisations that they support. So even if your organisation is a volunteer association and does not fall under the Work Health and Safety Act, it's a good idea to comply with the general work health and safety duties. So one of the key questions that we've been asked quite often is, what is a person conducting a business or undertaking, or a PCBU? Whether your organisation is a PCBU depends on the facts and circumstances, such as whether you employ workers and whether you control or influence the work done by workers or volunteers, and whether they're undertaking work activities. So a PCBU that employs people to work, whether it's for profit or non-for-profit, is considered to be a PCBU. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do not employ paid workers, then you're treated as a volunteer association. It's important to note also that workers are not PCBUs, so volunteers who are also considered to be workers are not PCBUs. So if a volunteer organisation is a PCBU, then they have a primary duty of care. This means that they're required to ensure the health and safety, so far as is reasonably practicable, of workers, including volunteers, and any other people who may be at risk from the work being carried out by the business or undertaking. So this applies when your organisation has directs or influences work carried out by workers. It engages or causes to engage a worker to carry out work, including through subcontracts, or it has management or control of a workplace. The primary duty of care is tied to the work activities wherever they occur, and it's not limited to the confines of a physical workspace. Reasonably practicable is a term that's regularly used throughout the Work Health and Safety Act, and it's a very important term. What it means is it's not about guaranteeing safety. It means doing what is reasonable to ensure health and safety. If your organisation is run by volunteers, this is taken into account. An important note as well is that health includes mental health. So that means that organisations also need to do whatever they can to prevent things like workplace bullying, harassment and discrimination. The duties of a volunteer organisation include providing and maintaining a work environment without risk to health and safety, providing and maintaining safe plant and structures and safe systems of work, the safe use, handling and storage of plant structures and substances, accessible adequate facilities for workers' welfare, which may include things like toilets or first aid facilities, and providing relevant work health and safety information, training, instruction or supervision. The Work Health and Safety Act also prohibits discrimination or unfair treatment of workers, including volunteers, if they've raised a work health and safety concern. A person found to be engaging in this type of discrimination may be liable to criminal penalties. Under the Work Health and Safety Act, the term worker includes a volunteer. A volunteer is a person who works without payment or financial reward, and financial reward does not include payment of out-of-pocket expenses such as travel or meal reimbursements. Workers and volunteers have the same duties under the Work Health and Safety Act, that is, to take reasonable care of their own health and safety at work, ensure that others are not put at risk or adversely affected by their actions, comply with instructions so far as they're reasonably able, and cooperate with any reasonable work health and safety policy or procedure of the PCBU. Volunteers cannot be prosecuted under the Work Health and Safety Act if they comply with their duties, but there are other laws that apply to volunteers. A PCBU will owe a work health and safety duty to both paid workers and any volunteers that it or its members engage. Officers is another topic that is quite widely misunderstood. The definition of officer was widened and made more explicit in the Work Health and Safety Act. Broadly, an officer is a person who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of an organisation's activities. In many organisations, this is likely to be your executive members, the highest level of management, and most other managers are not likely to be considered officers. They'll be more likely to be workers. Officer does not include elected members of government or a municipal council, so the president and council members are not officers. However, it may include the CEO or the chief financial officer and other members of the executive team. Officers have due diligence obligations which they cannot delegate. They are legally responsible for ensuring that workers and other persons are protected against harm, that the business has suitable safe work systems in place. They must take reasonable steps to ensure that PCBUs keep up to date on work health and safety matters, understand work health and safety risks specific to their organisation, implement processes to eliminate or minimise risks, use appropriate timely communication processes, and implement processes to ensure compliance with work health and safety laws. A number of questions have also been asked about accountability under the laws in terms of prosecutions. Officers of a PCBU who are not volunteers can be prosecuted for failing to comply with due diligence duties under the Work Health and Safety Act. However, volunteer officers who are unpaid cannot be prosecuted for failing to comply with their officer duties under the Act. This immunity for volunteer officers is designed to ensure that volunteer participation at the officer level is not discouraged. Volunteer officers can be prosecuted as a worker if they don't take reasonable care as a worker. And volunteers or workers cannot be prosecuted if they comply with their worker duties under the Work Health and Safety Act while working for the organisation. Some important principles to bear in mind with the Work Health and Safety Act are that a duty cannot be transferred to another person. Although activities can be undertaken by somebody else, if activities can be undertaken by someone else if the PCBU actively verifies that necessary steps have been taken to discharge that duty. Another principle is that a person can have more than one duty, so they may be more than one type of duty holder. For example, they manage or control the workplace or are also a PCBU that manufactures things. More than one person can have a duty for the same issue. In this situation, each person retains responsibility for the matter and the duty to the extent that they can influence and control the issue. So each person with a duty must, so far as is reasonably practicable, consult, cooperate, and coordinate activities with other people with a duty in relation to that same matter. PCBUs that share the same duty may enter into an arrangement that only one PCBU takes the required action. However, in order to fulfill their duties, the other PCBUs must make sure and check that the other PCBU is carrying out that required action. For example, a PCBU may not need to provide first aid equipment or facilities if these are already provided by another PCBU at the workplace. However, you must check that the equipment and facilities are adequate and accessible for workers and volunteers. Management of risks refers to duty holders being required to eliminate risks to health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable. If not reasonably practicable, then the risks must be minimized so far as is reasonably practicable. Section 18 of the Act refers to what reasonably practicable means, and we've also got guidance on our website to explain how that works. Essentially, it means ensuring that you do all that can reasonably be done to keep workers, including volunteers, safe and healthy. Consultation is an important concept in both the current OSH Act and the Work Health and Safety Act. PCBUs must consult workers and volunteers so far as is reasonably practicable on work health and safety matters that affect them. You may need a mix of consultation arrangements. How your organisation consults its workers and volunteers is not prescribed in the Act, and a mix of consultation arrangements may be better to suit the different types of workers and work situations within your organisation. For example, if there are a number of full-time workers in the organisation, then structured arrangements involving health and safety representatives and a health and safety committee may be considered suitable if the workers prefer that. For another organisation that engages contractors or on-hire workers or volunteers to carry out tasks, then toolbox meetings may be a more practical way to consult. Other options are to send out regular newsletters, update your website with work health and safety news and information or policies and procedures, having a suggestions email box for workers, allowing them to send their suggestions about health and safety matters, or holding regular meetings to talk to the volunteers about the work they do and how to do it in the safest possible way. We've had a number of inquiries from emergency service volunteer organisations, and there are similar requirements under the work health and safety laws as there are under the current OSH Act. The change from the current laws to the work health and safety laws should not affect emergency response because many of the requirements are the same. Reasonably practicable applies again, and this does not mean guaranteeing safety. It means ensuring you do all that can reasonably be done to keep workers, including volunteers and other persons, safe and healthy. Like all organisations, you need to assess the risks and determine what you can do to eliminate or reduce those risks so far as is reasonably practicable. For example, during an emergency, there is a risk of people forgetting or ignoring safety procedures. In that situation, you would need to consider that risk and eliminate or reduce it so far as reasonably practicable. How you do that depends on what is reasonably practicable, and it should include consulting your workers and volunteers. An officer under the Work Health and Safety Act is determined by their level of involvement in decision making for the whole or substantial part of the organisation. It is not determined by a role that they take in response to a specific emergency. Another important aspect of emergency service response is that if multiple PCBUs attend an incident, then all have duties so far as is reasonably practicable in relation to the health and safety of the workers or volunteers at the scene, ensuring that their activities do not expose others to unnecessary risks, and ensuring especially that they consult, cooperate, and coordinate activities with each other. There are a number of volunteer organisations that have workers working from their own home or assisting people in their own homes. The same duties apply. So the organisation has work health and safety duties to volunteers, and reasonably practicable applies. Volunteers have the duties of workers under the Work Health and Safety Act. So one of the things you may wish to do in these situations is communicate beforehand about specific hazards. That may include the property layout, which may include hazards such as steep or slippery stairs, pets or a remote location, or the risk of bushfires. If volunteers visit a number of homes, it may not be reasonably practicable to provide them information about specific hazards in each home. However, the organisation should provide information about the main hazards that they might encounter. The organisation should also consider the risk of volunteers being exposed to violence when performing volunteering work in a person's home. Violence can harm both the person it's directed at or anyone witnessing it, both physically and psychologically. It is best to eliminate the risk of exposure. If that's not possible, then minimise the risk as far as reasonably practicable. This may include things such as sending 2 volunteers, visiting in daylight only, and providing a reliable and quick means of communicating with the organisation to obtain assistance when required. In terms of communication, you need to consider things like mobile phone coverage and ensuring that phones are always fully charged at the start of the working day. So in summary, what do we need to do? Firstly, understand your duties. Many of the requirements of the Work Health and Safety Act are similar to existing requirements under the OSH Act. The Work Health and Safety Act has processes for resolving issues, and this process applies after work health and safety matters are raised or not resolved. Volunteer organisations also need to maintain awareness of other non-work health and safety laws which may apply. This could include things like workplace relations laws, which you can obtain from Fair Work Australia or Wageline, anti-discrimination laws, which you can refer to the Australian Human Rights Commission or the Equal Opportunity Commission, workers' compensation, insurance and civil liability, which you can obtain information from WorkCover WA, Volunteering Australia or Volunteering WA. As we mentioned several times during this presentation, reasonably practicable applies, and you need to identify hazards, assess and control those risks, and review risk controls. That does not necessarily mean that you have to create detailed procedures about how to do that. In certain circumstances, such as emergencies, it may not be appropriate to do that. So it's about using common sense to identify a suitable approach. Provide the right equipment, procedures and training. Consult workers and volunteers and other PCBUs about work health and safety matters. And if you have any serious incidents, act on them so that they don't happen again. I'm pleased to announce that our guide to work health and safety for volunteer organisations is now available on the website. So you can locate that by going to www.demers.wa.gov.au/WHS, and then go to the section about main responsibilities and duties under WHS, and you'll see the different guidance material listed there. If you need to lodge any more questions, you're welcome to go into Slido. You just type in the event code of #volunteer, and we encourage you to answer questions. There's already a number waiting in the queue, but please still keep them coming through. And if you need to stay in touch, we've got a wide range of newsletters and other products to keep you up to date. So you can see you can subscribe for newsletters. You can go to our website. We've got a Twitter and also a LinkedIn page and Facebook page available for you to keep up to date with the work health and safety laws.
Okay, David, thank you for that. Just before we start with the formal part of the questions, it's just a reminder to say that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the DMIRS website as soon as possible after this particular presentation. So we're now going to start with the questions. The format is that I'll ask the questions and between David and I, we'll both respond. So here we go for the first question, David. A farm worker attends a fire as a volunteer. He continues to be paid a wage, but is not under direction of the employer. Does the employer have the responsibility under the work health and safety laws?
So in this situation, the farm worker is a volunteer. Although they're being paid a wage, they're not under the direction of the employer. So in this situation, the farmer is not the PCBU. So the employer does not have responsibilities under work health and safety.
Thanks, David. As volunteers, we provide an activity which involves application of particular skills for benefit of others, no payment. Is this under the work health and safety laws?
So in this situation, we're providing an event where people are attending. I presume that's members of the public and others going to the event, whether it's members of the association and other things. So although it's not for profit or payment, it would still be required that you look after you've still got health and safety duties under the work health and safety laws to ensure that people are not exposed to risk from work health and safety matters.
It's also important, as David mentioned in the first part of the presentation, the fundamental issue is whether or not you employ people. So if the volunteer association doesn't employ people, it's not covered under the work health and safety laws. If they do employ people, well, that's a different matter, and there are PCBU duties there, as David has explained. Local governments have various volunteers, but is someone who does local government work without the local government's knowledge a volunteer? At what point does a person become a volunteer? So it's rather than being the volunteer, the duties apply if as I mentioned earlier, if the organisation employs people. So if you are a volunteer association and you don't employ people, the PCBU doesn't have duties. In terms of whether or not a local government worker is acting as a volunteer, I'm not sure that would necessarily have any consequence. If the local government's not in control of the work, they wouldn't have a duty. So anyway, that's the response in terms of the information we have available. If you are an officer of a charity and the charity has an ABN, does this make you a PCBU?
Well, it's a little unclear whether they're employing people. Although they've got an ABN, I don't think that necessarily means that they're employing people. So if people are being paid, so for example, you might have an organisation that employs a secretary or a bookkeeper, for example. So if they're employing someone and paying them, then the charity is a PCBU. So it really depends on the facts and circumstances. So Yeah, and an officer of a charity, I mean, it depends what they mean by officer as well. So if they're talking about an officer under the Work Health and Safety Act, then that depends on what their role is in terms of do they control either all or part of the organisation's activities.
And just while we're on that, David, I think we should mention that just because you have officer in the title of your job doesn't necessarily make you an officer for the purposes of the work health and safety laws. So as David mentioned earlier, you have to have a control, you need to be the controlling mind of the business and make decisions that affect the business as a whole. What risks and exposure do local government volunteer bushfire brigade leaders, officers in charge face with the changing work health and safety laws?
Well, under this one, the duties are the same as what they currently are under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So it's about doing what's reasonably practical in those situations. So in terms of exposure, we talked earlier about the accountability for prosecutions. So just go back to that, sorry. So officers of a PCBU who are not volunteers can be prosecuted if they fail to comply with due diligence duties. A volunteer officer of a PCBU cannot be prosecuted for failing to comply with their officer duties under the WHS Act. So it depends on what their role is and what the facts and circumstances are in terms of their involvement with managing an incident.
What are the work health and safety regulations or work health and safety laws regarding spontaneous volunteers?
So there's nothing specifically mentioned about spontaneous volunteers in the legislation. However, if you do have spontaneous volunteers, then one of the things that needs to be considered is, are they competent and properly equipped to do what you're going to deploy them to do? So if for example, you had an event or a incident where spontaneous volunteers turn up and say, I'd like to help, then you need to consider, have they got the appropriate equipment and clothing and PPE or personal protective equipment to do what you want them to do, and are they trained to do it? And do you have an ability to verify that they're appropriately trained to do it? Because if you use them, then you do have a duty towards them.
And that duty is the same under the existing occupational safety and health laws as well. So the next question, David. Does a volunteer organisation that employs a contractor for fire extinguisher checks come under the work health and safety regs?
So in this situation, if you're employing a contractor to do those checks, then if they're on your payroll and you're paying them a salary, then that would seem to be an arrangement where the volunteer organisation is a PCBU because they're paying the person to do the work. So they would have duties towards that contractor while they're doing those fire extinguisher checks.
Well, the other way to, once again, the question's not quite clear, but if they are a contractor and they're doing intermittent work such as fire extinguisher checks every 6 months or every 12 months, for example, depending upon your arrangements, that would be unlikely to be an employment arrangement. So you need to check. The work health and safety law uses the words employ deliberately. So the test is, do you employ the person? If you don't employ the person and they are a contractor, well, you're not a PCBU and you don't have a duty. So as I say, the important thing there is to decide if you employ the person or not. So if it's contractor, intermittent for such things as fire extinguishers, it may well be that you are not a PCBU. So the next question, what work health and safety duties apply to a farmer who has workers that also do firefight? And I assume that's probably volunteer firefighting.
So there's different scenarios that can apply in this situation. So you could have a farmer who has a worker and a fire develops on the farmer's property and the farmer directs the worker to go and fight that fire. In that situation, the worker is under the control of the farmer and the farmer is a PCBU. So the farmer has a duty towards that worker while they're doing their work, including the firefighting, because they've directed the worker to go and do it. There may be other situations where the worker volunteers to go and fight a fire, or they're called up by the local bushfire brigade, or something like that. In those situations, once they are no longer under the control of the farmer, and they're under, say, the local government or DFS or one of those government agencies, then they're no longer under the control of the farmer. The farmer is no longer a PCBU, and whoever is the new PCBU, so be it a government agency or local government, they become the PCBU in that situation. So the farmer's duties to the worker cease when that worker goes and does the firefighting. So that's where the farmer has not directed them to go. They're a volunteer firefighter and they've been called up to go and fight a fire.
Is a volunteer chief bushfire control officer an officer under the Work Health and Safety Act?
So this one, if they're a volunteer officer, they can still be an officer, but as I mentioned before, volunteer officers that are unpaid cannot be prosecuted for failing to comply with their officer duties under the Act. So they may still have responsibilities, but if they don't comply with them, they can't be prosecuted for it.
So as I mentioned earlier in relation to the title officer, in terms of being an officer under the Work Health and Safety laws, you have to be, if you like, the controlling mind of the organisation, and it can't be, for example, intermittent activities. So if you're a bushfire control officer, it's likely that you are not a PCBU, although you can be if, for example, you're involved in the organisation some way at a senior management level, reporting to a CEO or something like that. But as I've said it before, just because you have officer in the title of your name does not mean you are an officer for the purposes of the Work Health and Safety laws. Incorporated associations, organisations, community events. If anyone is injured on the premises, is it covered under the Work Health and Safety laws? Is the organiser responsible for that injury to the person?
So in this situation, we're talking about an incorporated association that's organised a community event, and if anyone is injured on the premises, they do have a duty to take reasonable care to ensure that people are not exposed to risk of injury or death. So yes, they do have a duty under the Work Health and Safety laws to do all that's reasonably practicable to ensure the safety of workers, volunteers, and other people that attend that event. They also would have some, in some cases, they may need to look at things like public liability insurance and other things like that. That's where other laws come into it.
So once again, the critical issue there is whether or not they employ people, which it's not clear whether they do. And it's important too that if you have businesses at a festival or something like that, the Work Health and Safety laws impose a duty for people to consult. So it's not purely the organiser's responsibilities. The Work Health and Safety laws make it clear that everybody who is involved in workers and even looking after other people who might be there have a duty. So it's important for you to consult, and that is a prescribed requirement in the Work Health and Safety laws, that there is consultation at what is effectively a workplace. The next question is, what is the definition of payment to a volunteer to make them a worker, e.g. an honorarium, nominal payments for service?
It's really a tricky one. I believe that if they're being paid anything other than out-of-pocket expenses, then they would be considered to be a worker, i.e. a volunteer, which means that the organisation that's making that payment is a PCBU. But it really depends on the facts and circumstances about how the activities of that worker are influenced and controlled and how they're paid.
So the definition of worker in the Work Health and Safety laws refers to volunteers. So if you are a worker, as a paid public servant, I'm a worker, a volunteer is a worker. So the definition of payment is not really relevant. You either are or are not a worker, irrespective of whether you are being paid. Just clarifying, a volunteer officer can't be fined with failing to comply with work health and safety, even if it affects a paid employee. So the volunteer officer can only be prosecuted if they breach their duty as a worker or as an other person at the workplace. So this is in relation to officer duties. So it's only those two options. So as a worker, or alternatively as an other person at a workplace. Can we have some clarity on the risks to a volunteer incident controller, please? So the incident controller, I assume this is something to do with bushfires. Well, the incident controller may well be a manager. That's one way to look at it, but they are also a worker. So in terms of the risks to the volunteer, I'm not sure what risks you're talking about, but I'll make a stab at it. In terms of risk, you have a duty to yourself to make sure that you, as David mentioned earlier, you as a worker, look after yourself and others and comply with reasonable instructions. And as a worker as well, you have similar sorts of duties. So the incident controller is a worker. They have some obviously management responsibilities, but they're still classed as a worker, is how I interpret that question. So the next question is, how can a local government fire control officer be expected to be able to assess a spontaneous volunteer's competency in the heat of fire response? So I think in terms of the heat of a fire response, if you had somebody who came up to you and said, I want to go and fight fires, if it were me, I would be saying, look, can you go and volunteer and speak to somebody else who might want some ancillary services provided to firefighters or something like that. But it would seem to me that if they want to go and fight fires, there is a requirement that they are trained. So I suspect that it's not unusual for emergency service situations for many well-meaning people to come forward, and ideally you would have a strategy to deal with those people. If a local government provides bags to a school group for beach rubbish cleanup, are the students volunteers? Yes. So the local government has a responsibility to that to those children. But the point I'd make with this is you already have that duty. So this is not an unusual situation. So it's important for the local government, obviously, to communicate with the students' teachers and, of course, the children as well, and set some clear boundaries for them. But I would imagine this is sort of standard practice for any of these sorts of events in any way under existing occupational safety and health laws. And for that matter, I'm sure the Education Department imposes those sorts of requirements as well. If we have a local tidy town group working in local government reserves, who is responsible?
I was just going to say, I think it's again the local government, because if they're doing the work on a local government reserve and presume it's in an agreement with the local government, then the local government has a duty towards the volunteers that are doing the tidy town cleanup to ensure that they're safe and healthy.
As David mentioned, though, this is reasonably the reasonably practical requirement overrides that as well. So the local government will obviously be responsible as far as reasonably practicable. Training volunteers is done by DFES fighting fires on state land. Training volunteers are done by DFES fighting fires on state land. Am I still a PCB if the brigade is registered to
council?
Okay, well, the question we come back to, I think, is the brigade a volunteer brigade? If it is a volunteer brigade, they are treated as volunteers. If they are registered with the council, as I've mentioned a couple of times, there is a reasonably practicable element to that. And of course, our expectation is that volunteers fighting fires are trained, and there is some control exercised by those in charge of the fire activities to make sure that people are reasonably, as far as reasonably practicable, safe. Do all onboarding procedures applicable to local government employees, i.e. health assessment, training, etc., are applicable to volunteers under the work health and safety laws? So you have a general duty to the volunteers, and of course there may be situations where that's clearly not necessary and not practical, and we've already talked about a couple of those. I think the discussion about volunteers working in parks, I can't imagine there would be any need for a health assessment. Training, you might need to alert the volunteers to any particular hazards that are there, but you just need to make sure there are procedures in place, because under the work health and safety laws, you are required to provide a safe workplace as far as is practicable. We are a volunteer organisation that have someone contracted to deliver an event, short-term based event. This would be classed as employee, yes? Well, I would say no. If you are a volunteer organisation that hasn't employed anybody, you have engaged effectively a contractor. That's how I would read that question. However, as the organiser of the event, you may well find that there are some public liability issues for you to address. And in terms of communicating with your event organiser and making sure there are systems in place so that it can be conducted appropriately, would be something that we would suggest to volunteer organisations. If an organisation only has unpaid volunteers, do the buildings they volunteer in need to have asbestos register under the Work Health and Safety Act? So the asbestos registers are required at a workplace. So if the buildings are a workplace, they would need to have an asbestos register under the existing occupational safety and health laws. That threshold is 1990. Under the work health and safety laws, there will be a new threshold of 2003. If the volunteers are meeting at a building that is not a workplace, well, an asbestos register will not be required there. 90% of lands around us are UCL lands with native title, mining tenements, reserves, and not managed by us. How do I, as a PCU, provide safe access? So as a PCBU, you would need, I'm not quite sure of the exact circumstances, but if you're a PCBU and you have workers coming onto your property, you would need to make sure the roads are reasonable. If for example, the roads on the native title UCL lands are not safe, well, you would need to advise the person concerned. So you have I guess the long answer, you have a duty to make sure that workers can work safely for you. So you need to provide a safe system of getting there. A volunteer abuses another volunteer. There is ongoing conflict. They both don't want to resolve the issue and continue to abuse each other. Is that an OHS issue? Okay, so we go back to the fundamental issue. Is the volunteer part of a volunteer association? If the abuse is occurring between two volunteers not related to work, well, it's not a work health and safety issue. If the conduct is being conducted at a workplace, there is an occupational safety and health issue there which needs to be managed. And in terms of how that issue is managed, that's really up to the workplace to determine. And of course, it will depend upon things such as the circumstances, the nature of the abuse, etc. So those are all things that you will need to consider. But yes, you will have duties there. It's also important to note that the volunteers have duties, as David has mentioned, to make sure that their conduct as workers does not affect others. So there is a, as I say, there will be an issue if it is a workplace for work health and safety laws. Pastoral leaseholders go on a DFES preferred supplier list fighting fires on state land. Am I still the PCBU as the CEO for the local government? So as I read that, the person asking the question is saying that they are the chief executive officer for the local government. Pastoral lease to go. Am I still the PCBU? So if you're the chief executive officer of the local government, you are an officer. So the local government is the PCBU. Perhaps if you can ask the question to clarify that, because I'm not quite sure I can even have a stab at giving an answer to that the way it's drafted. Is a community emergency services manager an officer under the Work Health and Safety Act?
Well, it depends on what their role is in terms of if they're involved in local government, for example, like a shire, then it depends what their role is. Again, it comes back to the facts and circumstances and what their role is in terms of controlling and influencing work. So it's about whether they control all or part of the work that's being undertaken by that organisation. So if it's local government, then what's their capacity to control and influence all or part of the activities of that organisation?
So in terms of being an officer, the general rule, if you like, will be the CEO and their immediate report. So it would seem that a community services manager is probably not on the executive, because they're more likely to have a title such as director. So that's how we would see that. We are a local government and only have volunteers compiling a local paper. Are they to have the same training as a paid staff member would receive? Are we responsible?
Yes, because the local government employs people, then you have a duty to unpaid workers just the same as you do to paid workers. So you would need to provide them appropriate training, provide the necessary equipment and things like that. So yes.
It matches their work. So if they're doing the identical work to a paid worker, they should receive the same training, supervision, etc. If you are not part of a PCBU but are a volunteer, who is responsible for you? So if you're not part of a PCB, so if you're volunteering, presumably you are going to a local park perhaps to help with weeding. But that would be probably something to do with local government. So if you are a volunteer and you are at a workplace, you are to be treated the same as a paid employee like me, for example. If you are part of an association, or if you are just volunteering for a volunteer association, the work health and safety duties do not apply.
But yeah, it depends who's directing, controlling the work that you're performing. So if it's, say, a local government telling you to go and clean up a park, then the local government is the PCBU because they're directing, controlling your activity, and local government employs and pays people to do work. So they would have a duty to both their paid workers and any volunteers that work for them. So it really comes down to who is directing you to perform the work that you're undertaking. So whoever that is, they would need to ask the question, depending on whether they employ people or not, that will determine whether they're a PCB or not.
And once again, we just might reiterate that that's the situation that applies at present under the existing occupational safety and health laws. If your volunteer organisation has a paid executive officer based in another state, is your organisation considered a PCBE for the purposes of the Act? Well, this will depend upon the structure of your association. So if it's separately incorporated in Western Australia, and there was no paid employee in WA, probably not. However, if the executive officer was exerting control over the whole organisation in WA, quite possibly. Unfortunately, that's one of those questions where we can't provide a direct answer apart from a couple of generalisations. So, as I would say, if you're just a volunteer association in WA, it's quite probable that you're not, but it will, however, depend upon the circumstances. So a spontaneous farm fire response, don't check in with fire control officers or the Shire. Is it then not reasonably practical that we know their competence? So spontaneous farm fire response, don't check in with control officers. So if it's on a farm, it's not quite clear what that's asking. But
They're
anyway,
talking about spontaneous volunteers. They're not reporting into the fire control officers.
So they're just going, but if they're going to a farm, the farmer would have a duty to that person in terms of making sure that they can help in a safe manner, so things don't change. Sure, that's quite what they're asking, but that's how I read that. Is a not-for-profit board member volunteer considered an officer?
This really depends on how the board operates, and again, it comes back to the facts and circumstances about what control they have over the activities of other people, such as volunteers and workers, and how the board members are. Even if it's a not-for-profit board, if the volunteer who's on that board is being paid to do what they're doing, then they would be perhaps considered an officer, but it's not clear from the question whether that not-for-profit board member is being paid.
Can the volunteer who is controlling the bushfire response be prosecuted under the new Act if someone is injured at the fire? So, I know we've said this a couple of times, but this is the same situation at present. So if the person is a volunteer, they have a duty as a worker to make sure that it's reasonably practicable, that they don't influence or they don't cause injury to other parties. So in terms of someone volunteering, if the volunteers are trained and the person takes reasonable action, as I said earlier, exactly the same as under the existing laws, no one will be prosecuted. We've talked about reasonably practicable a number of times, and the department does understand and does recognise, as do the laws for that matter, that some situations are a bit less, or I'll say a bit more chaotic, if you like, than others, and that's why that reasonable practicability is there. So in terms of the liability for those involved with bushfires under the work health and safety laws, our expectation is that there won't be that much change, although when we go back to volunteers, the work health and safety laws make it clear that volunteers have the same rights as workers who might be at a particular workplace. My organisation has contracts with 100% volunteer associations that do activities for us with the public. What is our responsibility and what is their responsibility? So I guess we'll take it that your organisation is a PCBU. I've just talked about reasonably practicable, and during David's presentation, he also gave a couple of examples of organisations involved with volunteers. So it depends upon the circumstances. Sometimes it can be quite easy for people to determine particular hazards, but where you have volunteer associations or volunteers who might be going into any number of different homes, it's appreciated that it may not be possible to identify every particular hazard at a workplace. However, if people are volunteers, there is an expectation that as far as reasonably practical, they will have safe systems of work. And that may well be making sure that volunteers have telephones, or making sure that when volunteers go to homes, they go in pairs if that's how it is deemed to be safe. So once again, it depends upon the circumstances, and the law recognises or endeavours to recognise those circumstances. But the bottom line is the work health and safety laws are there to make sure, as far as reasonably practicable, that people can go to work and come home at the end of the day safely. If a sporting club pays members a small fee to umpire for their sports season, would that be considered an employee? No, is my answer, because they're not employees. The way I take that example is that they're just providing a stipend or fees. They're not being employed as an employee. They don't pay tax. There's no work superannuation or anything like that. So it comes down to that employee definition, and you'll need to look at labour law from that. But as I say, if a sporting club offers a small payment to umpires, that's unlikely to be a PCBU. We are a volunteer organisation employing a manager. That manager then hires and fires part-time and casual staff. Is that manager then a responsible officer?
It depends on the relationship or how much control they have over all or part of the organisation. If they're an employee manager and they're not actually in charge of the finances and the operation of that volunteer organisation, they're just a manager, say a middle level manager, for example, then they would not be considered a responsible officer. They're not, if they're not in the executive, the top level management, like the CEO or the chief financial officer, then they would not be considered to be an officer. They would be treated as a worker.
So if you're employing a manager, first of all, as a volunteer organisation, you are a PCBU if you are employing a manager. And as a PCBU, you have responsibilities to the manager and to any staff they may employ. So we've talked a couple of times about the need for consultation. The volunteer organisation and the manager need to come to an agreement in terms of processes, and obviously involve themselves with any staff that may be working there as well. So volunteer organisation may employ a manager with high skills, so that would be one way of meeting their duties. But the volunteer organisation, you're employing a manager. The short answer is you have duties, as does the manager, and of course any workers that may be engaged, and you must consult. We only have a few minutes left. We'll answer as many of your questions as we can in that time. Any questions that we don't get to, we will use for the development of guidance and information on our website. And of course, we're doing our best to get as much information on the website as we can. And when David provided his presentation, he also talked about the various social media options available for us as well. Just a further commercial, if you like. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the WorkSafe website as soon as possible in the very near future. If our volunteers, Just one question, if we can. Sorry, we're just scrolling through our questions. If our volunteers are paid Aboriginal Ranger group paid for by the Conservation group, but act as our Bushfire Brigade volunteers, am I still the PCBU? So if our volunteers are paid Aboriginal Rangers, but act as Bushfire Brigade volunteers, am I still the PCBU? Once again, the way I read that is that the Aboriginal Rangers are paid, but they also are members of the volunteer Bushfire Brigade. If that's the case, they are much the same as any other volunteer who might have a daytime job. They will be volunteers. So if you are the PCBU and employing the Aboriginal Rangers, if they volunteer to go and fight the fire, it is unlikely that you will be the PCB responsible for them, because you
While
don't
they're
have
doing the firefighting.
Well, yes, while they're doing the firefighting, because you don't have any control over their activities. So I think that's just about the end of our session today. We've run out of time. Thank you for your attendance, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of the questions that you asked. The government is in the process of finalising the work health and safety regulations. Once those regulations are finalised, of course, they will be published. There'll be material provided over the DMIRS website, and DMIRS officers will also be visiting not just the metropolitan area, but we'll also be visiting regional areas as well, and we'll be providing information through our website and as many local media as possible about our attendance. But the intention is the department will be travelling throughout the state, providing seminars in relation to the work health and safety laws as soon as they become public. Thank you again for your attendance.
Thank you.